You know, this is the US dollar. It is the official currency of the United States, but also some other countries use it as their official currency as well. The US dollar is known as the world's reserve currency. So how exactly did it become so powerful? More than $1.8 trillion of the US currency is now in circulation around the world, and it's believed that 2/3 of $100 bills and nearly half of $50 bills are held outside the US. The US dollar is the de facto global currency, meaning it's kept by many governments in reserves, and that most people and companies trust it for international trade. Even as coronavirus pandemic wreaked havoc across global markets, wiping out trillions of dollars worth of assets, the US dollar was unaffected by the turmoil. At one point, it soared nearly 4% against a basket of major currencies, namely the euro, pound, yen, Canadian dollar, and Swiss franc. So why did we see this spike in the value of the US dollar? The dollar is strong because of the US economy. In times of uncertainty, investors flee to what's known as safe havens. That is, investments expected to hold their value during market turbulence. And you guessed it, the US currency is seen as such. Why is that? Well, it hails from the world's largest economy, the United States, which is generally politically and economically stable. And while you can be pretty sure that the US dollar's value will fluctuate, it probably won't plunge the way the Turkish lira or the Argentinian peso have. All that demand for the US dollar can cause shortages during times of economic crisis, which only exacerbates the larger problem. America's central bank, the Federal Reserve, is responsible for issuing the currency and takes extra measures to prevent a squeeze when there's a rush for the greenback. For example, during the financial crisis of 2008 and the recent coronavirus crisis, the Federal Reserve set up swap lines with other major central banks, making sure that they have enough money available for investment and spending. This helps stabilize currency markets when the desire for the US dollar surges. So how exactly did the US dollar become the major reserve currency of the world? For a long time, developed countries tied their currencies to gold. However, during the First World War, many of these countries abandoned this gold standard and started paying their military expenses with paper money instead. Eventually, the US dollar, which was still tied to gold, overtook the British pound to become the world's leading reserve currency. During World War II, the United States sold weapons and supplies to many of its allies and collected payments in gold. By 1947, the US had accumulated nearly 70% of the world's gold reserves, leaving other nations with a huge disadvantage. To try to remedy this and other financial matters, 44 allied countries met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944. There, they decided that the world's currencies would be pegged to the US dollar, which was in turn linked to gold. As central banks around the world began to build their reserves over time, these dollars were redeemed for gold, dwindling the US's stockpile and igniting concerns about the stability of the US dollar. In 1971, US President Richard Nixon shocked the world when he de-linked the dollar from gold. From there, free-floating exchanges were born, meaning exchange rates were no longer fixed to gold and were determined by market forces instead. Despite periods of market volatility and inflation that followed, the US dollar has remained the world's reserve currency. Its sheer volume and America's efficient banking system made the notes more convenient and cheaper to trade than other countries. Today, the vast majority of foreign exchange transactions are done in the US dollar, with no other currencies coming anywhere near that. In recent decades, the US has even been accused of weaponizing its currency for strategic and geopolitical influence. One example cited by the critics was the Trump administration's sanction on North Korea and Iran, which included forbidding them from using the dollar in trade. Some economies are so reliant on American notes, they are even commonly used in day-to-day transactions. At an ATM in Cambodia, you can withdraw the greenback from the machines. On a global scale, you will find commodities like metal, energy, and agricultural goods are usually traded in the US dollars. So we have established that the US dollar is stable. But you might be thinking, what about other currencies that are stable too, like the Swiss franc or the Singaporean dollar, both of which come from politically and economically stable countries? And yes, while those are fair points, the truth is these countries have far less influence and economic power. Switzerland's population is a mere 8 million, while the US has more than 332 million. Just look at the central bank's foreign exchange reserves worldwide. While the majority of currency reserves are made up of the US dollar, the euro makes nearly 21%, the Japanese yen makes up nearly 6%, and the pound sterling makes nearly 5%. So could any of these other currencies give the dollar a run for its money? For many years, there have been calls for an alternative reserve currency, ranging from countries like China and Russia to intergovernmental organizations like the United Nations. In recent years, however, some central banks have added the Chinese yuan to their reserves. The cloud of US sanctions has also prompted a desire for some countries to bypass the dollar-dominated trading. In 2018, Germany's foreign minister wrote that it is essential that we strengthen European economy by establishing payment channels independent of the US. And some are hoping that the world's reserve currency won't be tied to national governments at all. They see cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin eventually overthrowing the dollar. But even so, any changes in the US dollar's strength certainly won't happen overnight. Despite calls for alternative reserve currency, it is hard to imagine any country capable of taking the mantle from the US as the global currency anytime soon.